Welcome everyone to our monthly ChIPs Talent Connector webinar. I'm Bridget Johnson, ChIPs Director of Partnerships and Business Development. And with me helping today is Olivia Moore, who is ChIPs Communications and Marketing Manager. ChIP's mission is to advance and connect women in IP law. We do a fantastic job connecting people through our chapter events, our Next Gen Summit, and our Global Summit. These Talent Connector webinars are to help you advance. We want to help you shine when those opportunities come up to advance. So, for example, it could be an opportunity within your organization for promotion or from an opportunity outside of the organization. This month's Talent Connector webinar is focusing on compensation negotiation strategies, and it's featuring an industry executive, Ann Kerwin, and her associate, Maddie Murray, both of whom work for Kerwin Associates. Just as a quick housekeeping tip, if you have a question for Ann and Maddie, please just put it in the chat, and Olivia will be monitoring the chat for them. Now I'm going to turn this over to Ann.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ann Kerwin-Payne. Thank you so much to Bridget and Olivia and ChIPs for having Maddie and I on today. I'm an executive search consultant, and I'm tasked with building legal teams and solving complex hiring problems. I've been in the legal recruiting business for a very long time and have witnessed thousands of compensation negotiations. And our hope is today that we can just give you a couple of nuggets around compensation negotiation. We're passionate about working for our clients, pleasing them, but we're also equally passionate about elevating women's careers. And that's been a focus of our practice for 35 years.
Hi, everyone. My name's Maddie Murray, and I'm a partner here at Kerwin, so I work closely with Ann. I started my career at Heidrick and Struggles and spent some time in-house at Pinterest doing executive search. So I've seen a lot of different negotiations over my career, so excited to chat about that topic today. Generally, Kerwin, our firm, works at all levels. So we place paralegals, we place general counsels. So we've seen all levels of negotiation as well from our side. We're excited to get started today. So thanks for joining us. So I'll just go ahead and get started. So Kerwin recently ran a report where we surveyed 300 lawyers in our network to see ask questions about compensation and negotiating compensation. On this slide, you see kind of 96% of legal professionals have negotiated their compensation in their career. That tells me something really exciting, I think, from our perspective, is compensation and negotiation is front and center for everyone. It's no surprise that as the economy changes, as costs increase, folks need to negotiate their compensation. And if you see here, 26% of people negotiating their compensation in 2025, so this calendar year, 28% in 2024, 16% in 2023, 8% in 2022, and 18% of people have not negotiated their comp since 2021, and 4% have never negotiated before. So I think for this group, what I want us to take home about this is candidates are negotiating compensation. Whether you're at your current company, 48% of folks, or at a new company, 52% of folks, it is a conversation that lawyers are having.
Yes. And Maddie, we know that negotiating comp is an art, and we've seen it in its finest form. It's also lawyers are hired to negotiate on behalf of their companies. But we know that it is incredibly hard to negotiate on your own behalf. Know your worth, advocate for yourself. So we feel it. We have to do it ourselves, and we know it's challenging. So today, the good news is there's more transparency. When I started in this business over 35 years ago, which is scary, no one talked about money. No one knew. You knew what law firm comp was generally, but now there's a lot more data and people, a lot more transparency. We still have a ways to go, but it's helpful in terms of women advocating on their own behalf. Years ago, our firm did a panel where we had seasoned GCs talk about negotiating compensation. And I'll never forget this one CLO who's kind of famous in the Valley said, think about the $5,000 you left on the table when you were a fourth year negotiating to move in house. what that would be like 15 years later, how that money would have compounded. And it really gave me pause and food to thought, because sometimes you think, oh, $5,000 doesn't really mean that much. But if you think about it over the long term in your career, it really does. So, I look, my perspective on compensation is very holistic. And my philosophy, and I think ours of the firm, is you have to look at compensation wholly. It's not just about the money, the equity, but I think we're hearing more and more about, is it that I have to be in an office? Is it a remote role? What kind of hours and demand of the, is it? Do I have to commute? What do the benefits look like? Is this an opportunity where I have an ability to grow and learn? What kind of industry is it? How many people am I managing? So there are a lot of things that just come into the whole of compensation. Many lawyers will give up, money, leave it on the table for a growth opportunity and a bigger title, right? Others won't do that. Many lawyers will leave jobs to manage and take the same pay, but get to manage a team. So I really think it's important to look at compensation holistically, even as well as the comp package, the base bonus and equity. I think before engaging in negotiation, whether internally or externally, you really need to look at yourself and say, what are my pain points? What's important to you? What are the top 3 things that you want to get in your next role or in your current role around compensation and this holistic approach?
I think just to add on to that, I think even before, if you're maybe thinking about a new job, even before engaging with a recruiter, I would almost come up with your top 3 things you need from that next role. If you want more compensation and that's the number one priority for you, at least know that, right? If you need more flexibility and that's number 2, number 3 is a growth opportunity, a different manager, whatever it may be, I think that is really important to kind of have as your guiding light when walking through any negotiation because you can always fall back on that. Um, I think let's talk a little bit about aspects of compensation. So, base salary. Interestingly enough, we found that base salary was the most commonly negotiated aspect of compensation. I think that probably isn't surprising to a lot of folks on this call, given the cost of goods and the cost of living in different areas across the United States. I think it's tangible cash that people want to negotiate. There are ranges, as you've probably seen, on different job descriptions. What I always tell candidates is to take those at face value, but also understand where the company is going to come in on those ranges. Typically, what happens in our search practice is a company will give us a range, let's say 200 to 250, just as an example. Their philosophy on comp is to pay at the middle of that range. And I think that's really important to think about when you're understanding or talking to someone about the recruiting process and talking about base salary. I think it's also important to know the way the company thinks about titles and leveling. A lot of times, base salary is tied to titles, it's tied to leveling within the company, and there's not a lot of wiggle room beyond um, that. So that's something to think about as well. And I also think it's important when you're walking into maybe a new organization to understand when you will be considered for a raise. Okay, today your comp is going to be X number when you walk in. That's great. What does the review process look like? We've had candidates that come to us, and say, I haven't had a raise in 3 years and I haven't been put up for promotion in 3 years. And I really had the assumption that I was going to get a raise in the first year. So I think aligning on expectations, really, really understanding base salary is important. I do think it is one of the most negotiated pieces.
Yeah, and I think Maddie too, one of the things I want to comment on the bands that they put on these job descriptions, Maddie's right. I think if you're dealing with a talent professional in-house, you can say to them, where do you historically come in on the band? Because my comp is at the high end of the range. I will tell you that a lot of times they give you these bands and we talk to these people about doing these searches in these ranges. And we have to say, you know what? I think you're going to have to come out of band on this. And a lot of times they do. So if you're looking at bands of a job and the job is of interest to you and you make a lot more, sometimes you just don't know if that band is going to be expanded. That's another point I will bring up. But I think that these questions around base salary and bands can be asked, slid in when you're talking, if you're dealing with a third party like us, we're talking from inception, but you can bring them up to talent professionals when you're telling about yourself, at the end of the conversation, you can start talking about these things. I want to touch upon bonus. Not everyone has a bonus. Not all bonuses are created equal. And they're probably the least negotiated because these bonuses, if they're at a public company, are tied to these bands. But one of the things you want to ask is there are a number of questions. Number one, is there a bonus on top of it? How is the bonus paid out? When is the bonus paid out? What is the bonus made up of? And has it historically been paid out? I will ask that questions, and many times I'm surprised. Well, last year we didn't pay out bonuses because the company wasn't doing well. We're coming out of a pretty tough time, so a lot of people were not getting bonuses. Other companies, bonuses are integral to comp. They're paid out at the number or more. So you've got to understand, what they've historically done. I would also say that there are sign-on bonuses at some of these companies. Some just don't do it, others will do it. I recently had a candidate who said to me at the end of the negotiation or at the end of the process, they were making her an offer, I really like a sign-on bonus. She did not have a current role and hadn't worked for a year for, substantial reason. And I said, look, generally they would give you a sign-on bonus if you were leaving public company equity on the table, if you were leaving a bonus on the table, but they don't generally do it. And there's no real reason here to give you a sign-on bonus. So it's really company to company. Maddie, anything else you add about the sign-ons?
Yeah, I think, and then I'll get to some of the questions in the chat. I see you guys putting some interesting questions in here. I think about the sign-ons, I would say that generally they're used at senior levels. So it's not often we see sign-ons being given to mid-level or junior lawyers, but if there's a niche practice area or some specialization and they really are needed to get someone over the line, that's when they're used. The question in the chat is how tough should you be in these negotiations in light of your desire for the job and eventual need to work with people, managers, and execs that you are negotiating with, which is a really great question. And I don't know if you want to maybe tackle that
Yeah,
quickly.
I think it's a real fine balance. You want to hold your line, but you don't want to come across too aggressive because you never know. I think the biggest thing is always to come across positive. A lot of great candidates will say to me, I don't want comp to stand in the way, but they're holding their ground at the same time. They're not gonna waffle. They know their value. They've done their homework. So you want to be firm. You don't want to be that you're all about the money because it does kind of turn people off. So there is a way, it's an art, as I said earlier, and I think you can chip away at it through the process,
Yeah.
and hold your ground, and it will come out, people are gonna give or they're not gonna give. Um,
I think it's a really good question. And I think this is often something we hear a lot of like candidates who say, I don't want to be too aggressive. And what my advice to be is, like Ann said, to be firm, but to pick what is important to you. I think when things go sideways in these negotiation processes are almost when candidates aren't being realistic. So they're asking for something that maybe doesn't match the company structure. So, for example, you're joining a very early stage startup as a lawyer. They have been very clear, we don't pay high on the base salary, but we'll give a lot in equity. And then you over and over again are asking for more on the base salary. I think there's a nuance there to that you probably should take what they're saying at face value. They've been pretty clear about their compensation philosophy, and I think where I see misses sometimes in this process is where people are pushing on the wrong things. Like they've told you they maybe could be more flexible with equity, so lean into that and negotiate on the equity side. I also think really important, and we'll get to this in a little bit because I do want to keep moving through our presentation here, but making sure you are making one ask is really, really important. And I think what will happen in these processes, and I hate to go to the negative, but that's often what we see when they're, learning experiences, is someone will say, "Hey, can I have a little bit more on base?" And then they have to go back to the comp team and ask on base, and they say, "Actually, you know what? I also really need a vacation at this time." And oh my gosh, actually, can you see if we can do more equity? And that like almost scattered approach gets people really, really frustrated. And the internal compensation team even comes to the lawyers and is like, does this person even want this job? They're just dangling these things that they want versus coming to the group and saying, look, so excited about this role, and this is why. I'm excited about the growth opportunity. I'm excited about the team. Always leading with the reason you want to accept the job and say, here's how I think we can get there. I think if we could get a little bit more on base salary, a little bit more on equity, and these are the numbers where I'd accept at, I think that's where you really can guide the talent team and the internal team, wherever you're headed, to be like, look, if we can get as close to these numbers, we could probably get this person in the seat. That's where I think the compensation negotiation is a really positive experience for everyone.
I'm going to jump in. You have a lot of questions in the chat. These are all fantastic questions, everyone.
Okay.
They're really detailed, but I did hear you say that you did want to get further into the presentation as well. And so would it be appropriate to maybe address some of these a little bit later in the presentation?
Yeah, well,
Yes.
why don't we talk? I know there's a lot of questions about equity, so why don't we get into equity because I can
Yep.
see them and talk about it. And then, Olivia, if you see any pressing, like please guide us a little bit here. So, Mad, why don't you start with the equity piece here?
Yes. So we've talked about base, we talked a little bit about bonus. Now we're going to get into equity. Equity is probably one of the most ambiguous and oftentimes most confusing pieces of compensation. The most important thing you need to understand from my perspective is what is the value of the equity? And how do you earn it? So, what is the dollar amount, whether you can get a price per share or whether that's public, depending on the stage of the company, to understand the dollar amount and then also understand the vesting structure. We have seen 4-year grants that have a 1-year cliff that then vest quarterly. I would say that is the most common thing I see. And again, we focus mostly on with technology companies, so I think that's important to call out. But I've also seen 3-year vests and I've seen 5-year vests and I've seen front-loaded equity where you vest not 25% a year, but maybe 35% in the first year. And it kind of tears down from there. So I think when you're talking about equity, it's getting as much information as you can to understand. We have a lot of like ChatGPT. We have amazing resources now to be able to put into chat or to some AI tool, if you use that, to say, what are the questions that I should be asking? But to me, it's what's the value of the equity? How do you earn it over time?
Yeah, and I would say to add to that, so you have your public, I think, let me frame it this way. I think one of the biggest challenges from where we sit is when a private company, startup private company, Series A, B, or C, wants to hire a lawyer and they need someone from a public company. They need that product talent. They need that head of legal. And how do you get someone out of public company equity to come to a private company? They're holding public company equity that's valuable. They're leaving $400,000 to $800,000 maybe on the table. And as we all know, in a private company, Series A, B, or C, venture backed, you're betting on the future of the equity and stock option grants. And how do you value that equity? It's surprising how many lawyers really haven't done it before if they've only been in public companies. And so if we're talking about leaders, GCs, CLOs, heads of legals that are going to these companies, they're saying, I'm getting these calls and I've got an offer. Can you help me here? And I've got they're giving me 0.3, they're giving me 0.5, they're giving me 0.75. And then they're looking and saying, the market is saying I should get 1. I really think the most important thing to know is the value of the equity and what the business story is behind it. So generally, and Maddie and I will get into this, these conversations around equity often aren't had in the first conversation. If we're dealing with even a DGC at a privately held company, one of these venture backed, it's generally we're trying to extricate what is the range on this equity going to look like? And a lot of times we're educating them on what it's going to look like. So we don't know, and we're trying to help the candidate. The candidate's saying, this is what I need. We're trying to educate the client. but they don't have the bands together yet. But so generally it's the mid-search, we're getting more information, so we're not wasting anyone's time on the equity. But it's not all about the percentage. It's all not all about the number. It's the story behind it. It's the valuation and it's what it's going to become. And a lot of times at the end of these processes with privately held company, they're opening up their information to the candidate they want to hire. And they're saying, here's the numbers. This is the value 409A. This is the valuation. And this is what our story is behind it. This is our business plan. And this is what we think your equity will become if we succeed. So that's how I really think about the private company equity. On here is a quote from a GC about the 409 value. You guys should take a picture of it. And that is somewhat of the formula. I hate to say that this is black letter law, because I do think when people are negotiating equity, you need to, like Maddie said, do your homework, talk to your mentors, talk to corporate lawyers who deal with this stuff, or comp execs, to really get educated.
I think the other thing that I'll just add to this is a lot of companies will give an initial grant, right? But I think it's very important to understand what is their philosophy on follow-on equity. And oftentimes this isn't something that I will know as an external search partner. Maybe they'll say, oh yeah, we do follow on equity, or oh yeah, we will give another grant, but it's not something that I necessarily have granular information on because we work with so many different companies and there are so many different structures. I would encourage, if you're negotiating compensation, whether you can talk to a talent partner at the end of the process, the recruiter you're working with, or even better, if you can talk to the hiring manager and say, look, I've got some questions about this equity. When I get a performance review, will I get an increase in equity? What does that look like? How, like any information you can gather is really helpful because this is your chance to negotiate, right? The biggest grant you're going to get is when you walk in the door, typically. But I think it's really important. Like if you want to stay somewhere for 4 years, you need to know: am I going to get more equity in two? Am I going to get more equity in three? Let's see. Are there any good questions, Olivia? While we
Yes,
okay.
there are, of course. So there are two questions that are semi-related. Laura asked, what information do you need to know to really place a value on pre-IPO RSUs? Like, how do you know what's in the market? And then Julie similarly had asked, what is the formula for estimating the value of equity in a non-public company or startup?
Yeah, this is a hard one. So everything, this is why it's really just difficult, frankly, to look at offers apples to apples because every company is so different. As Anne mentioned, you need to know the 409A valuation, which reflects the fair market value of common shares and determines the strike price for the stock options. So depending on what you're getting, they should be able to, at the end of the process, share some numbers with you to give a value to the equity. Oftentimes, they won't even tell the recruiter what that is because it's very confidential information at these startups. And do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, the other thing is how diluted is it? You've got to get the information from the company. You can do your own homework as best as possible, but at some point they're going to share this with you. And you're going to be able to, do the calculations, or they're going to help you do it with you if you're the candidate. But again, they're not going to do it right up front. They're not going to give that information. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg and playing the game with them.
And generally at the end, I think the best offer negotiations we've seen are when the company comes with generally like an RSU sheet or an option sheet that says, hey, here's the number of shares you're getting. This is the price of the shares. This is how you value the equity. And this is what will happen if the company doubles in value. This is what will happen if the company triples in value. And generally, if startups have a pretty established comp team, they'll have something like that, which I think is important to like gather and use that as information to guide your comp discussion. But I also think if they don't have that, I think you can ask like these questions like, okay, if the company were to double, what would that mean for my equity? Can you help me walk me through this? And be transparent. If you've only had public company equity and you're excited about a startup, I think being a little vulnerable to whoever you're working with and saying, can you please help walk me through this is really helpful.
Before we move on from equity, Chloe asked, what is the market expectation for paying out remaining unvested equity for in-house moves? Is it common to pay out 1 year versus 3 year versus fully vesting, etc.?
This is a great question. Anne, do you want to take it or do you want me
Yeah.
to?
Well, why don't you start? Because I think it's interesting, depending on, we're talking about a public company?
I believe so.
Mhm.
I think this is where the rubber meets the road in some of these negotiations. It is generally what I've experienced in my career, the philosophy of you have to leave something to get something. And that is what I've heard since I started in recruiting, right? You have to give up something for the risk of pre-IPO equity. It is very unlikely, I think, and Anne, keep me honest here, that a company is going to say, hey, I'm going to pay you out for equity you haven't earned yet. You have to recognize the risk and be able to say, I'm giving up, this sure thing of earning public company equity to take a risk on what this equity will become in the future. And I think it's even more important why you need to understand the business goals and the strategy and just what your equity is, because they're generally not going to pay you out for the equity you're leaving on the table.
I mean, at a private company, I have seen situations where someone who has been maybe a leader has bought some of their equity or kept it or been granted to keep it, but generally you're leaving it on the table. That's why I think a lot of candidates come to us, and I think employers need to be careful at the 4 year mark and say I'm fully vested. And my last vest is November 15th. And after that, I'm free game. I'm going to be looking. I think on the employer side, you need to make sure that look at your people and say, okay, they've been here 4 years with their initial grant. They may think that way, and not be as loyal because of what they can get. But generally you're going to be leaving, something on the table. And I will say that, I've worked with candidates who've left big, all of the companies where, that have outstanding equity have left a lot on the table when they've said to themselves, you know what? I've got to get out. It's time to learn. It's time to let this go. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to go to a private company to do whatever that's, or late stage private company to take the risk to learn, just because they're bored. So
It
they will leave things on the table.
It kind of goes back to those values we talked about in the beginning. If compensation isn't your biggest driver, but your driver is managing a team or being at a small startup where you can see growth or getting into a different industry, I think this is the time where if you're looking at an offer and you're looking at what you're leaving on the table to say, are these other things more important to me, right? Is having a better manager, is having remote life where if or like hybrid in the office, whatever that may be
Having
more
a seat
important,
at the table,
having a seat at the table
seat at the
than
table,
I also think this is
yeah.
where sign-ons do come in, and this is again at the more senior levels, but the sign-ons do sometimes bridge the gap of the equity that you're leaving on the table. One last point on this, I think it is important when you're working with a recruiter or when you're working with a company to say, hey, I have an equity grant. Like right now, it's the end of the year, right? A lot of law firm lawyers are getting their bonuses that pay out either end of the year or February 15th. I have candidates that I'm talking to that say, Maddie, I need you to know I'm engaging in this process because I'm very excited, but I need to be sitting in my chair on February 15th to collect my bonus. And I, as a recruiter, need to work around that. But it is really important it's hard if you bring that up at the end, that's like a little bit difficult. And when Anne talks about kind of negotiating from the beginning, it's very helpful to bring that up like, oh, I have a vest January 15th that I want to be in seat for. And then I wouldn't start till early February, early on in the process. And do you want to start talking about some valuable lessons?
Sure. I think, one of the important things that, and we brought it up with one of the questions is to negotiate professionally. When Maddie was just talking about, bringing something up at the end of the process, I think when you're negotiating comp, it's a time that really it shows the candidate's true colors, but oftentimes, I have to be honest, shows the company's true colors. So if a candidate at the end of the process says, oh, I forgot to tell you I have this vest and I need to be in my chair till March 1, and they want this candidate to start on Jan 1, it rubs people the wrong way. So I think this is all about just generally open, transparent trust and communication. But we've seen offers being pulled by, like Maddie touched upon, once you get an offer and you have an offer in hand, you have all the pieces, and you then start bringing these, towards the end of the process, bring up things piecemeal, like, oh, vacation policy, oh, whatever, it really can rub people the wrong way. If throughout the whole process they've been kind of saying, like, for example, we had a candidate who we said, 330 is the top of the scale the whole time you're saying this. 330, 330. And at the end, they're like, I need 360. And the client just goes berserk. It's like, why are they asking for this? And they pull the offer. So, you want to negotiate professionally, you want to make sure that you are asking questions, and you should negotiate. They expect you to negotiate most times. I mean, lawyers negotiate for a living, but it's how you do it. Everyone comes at this process from pain points. Companies have a lot of pressures on them, GCs, CEOs, CFOs, a lot of pressure to manage costs, to manage companies. And candidates have been through a lot. They've been stuck in roles where they haven't been promoted, they haven't gotten raises. So you have to really think, just look at the 3,000-foot view of where everyone's coming from, at the same time, kind of doing your homework, Maddie, and maybe
Yeah.
talk about knowledge being power in these instances.
Yeah, I think we talked about it at the top of the hour a little bit that we have more information out there publicly about compensation than we ever have before, right? I think it's a great thing for women, right? When we talk about gender pay gap, because compensation is being talked about. If you have peers, actually have a good anecdote. There was a woman I was working with as a candidate. And I was talking to her about a specific role, and she said, "Well, my comp expectations are XYZ." I said, "That's interesting. Why are your comp expectations XYZ? Tell me how you've thought about this." She said, "Maddie, I've talked to 6 people that have the role I'd like to have. I've looked at a tech GC compensation report. I've done all my due diligence around this, and I have a spreadsheet that has titles and compensation." She's like, "I'll send it to you so you can see it." She sent it to me. I think this is a great example of someone who went out into her community, into the world, and said, was brave enough to ask other people or to benchmark with others. I think that is a way to just get information, benchmark with recruiters, look at postings of similar roles and see where the compensation comes in. There are always nuances to this, right? Like, there are different sectors of the tech industry that historically pay more. So if you're at a nonprofit, don't compare yourself to a cryptocurrency company because that's probably not going to match, right? But gather knowledge. Whether you're listening to something like this is great, whether you're talking to your peers, the Women's GC network is great. Like, there are avenues now where you can see what other people are making and use that to guide your discussion. Um,
I do think, Maddie, like you're saying, looking at a lot of different things, sometimes these salary surveys, it's really tough for us in dealing with in-house talent because they're like, well, Radford says this.
yeah.
Now, Radford, and this is a generalization, but in San Francisco, if you need a lawyer sitting in a chair 4 to 5 days a week, and they're saying that they make X, that survey isn't really right. That's why you've got to, I don't know, it's not always what it's going to take to get that talent. So you need to look, like Maddie's saying, like, get as much data as you can to make your case.
Yeah. And I think the other thing on the recruiter side, I'll speak from my experience, knowledge for me is power. So let's say we have a candidate who is looking at a role I'm presenting them for, but also is looking at other opportunities. And they say to me, "Maddie, I've got this other offer." And they are transparent about what that offer is. That is so helpful for me to use that information to then go to the client and say, "Look, Joe or Sally has an offer from X company and it's going to come in at 340. I know your range was up to 320, but can we move it a little bit?" The more information you give the team, the better, right? Like, I have an $80,000 bonus that I get annually. I get X amount of equity. Like, that can be used in the negotiation process in a very positive way if it does kind of help the recruiter kind of advocate for more or help you advocate for more. I think when you're advocating and when it's really hard is when a candidate comes and says, "Okay, I want a $30,000 sign-on bonus." Well, everyone would love a $30,000 sign-on bonus, right? When you can have a why behind that. Look, these benefits that you're offering, I have to pay more out of pocket for insurance than I do in my current company. So that will bridge the gap. That means so much more to me than just someone saying, "Hey, I want $30,000 in sign on." So I think where you can be transparent with recruiters and give them the knowledge or give the company the knowledge, why you're asking for the things you're asking for, I think it paints a picture and it makes you look like you're not just willy-nilly asking for things.
Yeah. And you can ask boldly and specifically with the knowledge,
Yeah.
and that is helpful. Olivia, are there any questions around this or anything that we should be paying attention to?
There's one question I think that's semi-related to this. So Diane asked, you mentioned applying for jobs even though the band is not high enough because sometimes the range is adjusted later. And as you're sort of talking about these good faith uh, negotiations, how far off from your expectations needs can it be and still be a worthwhile job to apply for, given that we have finite time and resources? And I'm just adding on for Diane, you want to be negotiating in good faith.
Yeah, I think so. I will tell you that, like Maddie just touched upon, when we're involved, and hopefully when inside talent or another recruiter's involved, they give you these bands. And if Diane's looking at this job description and saying, "Oh my God, I'm incredibly interested in this company. I'm incredibly interested in this role. It sounds like a really meaty role," and it's saying in the comp band is lower, I would still apply for it because I'm just saying from my perspective, what has had to happen, we're on a little bit of an uptick now. It's been a little bit of a tough time the last few years, but they've had to come out of band to get certain talent at certain companies. And so they will, what we will do, as Maddie said, as we're talking to candidates, we're educating the client from the beginning. Like, I don't think you can get someone for 280 for this. I don't want to say never, but I don't think you can. That might be the top of their range. And so we're educating them. A lot of times they stick to it and they want to pay. Maybe that means that Diane isn't a candidate for it because they really want someone that's got 5 years of experience. Other times they come out of band, they pay more money
I
because they
think it's,
need
oh,
senior
sorry.
talent.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
Yeah, go
interrupt
ahead.
you. I think also it's important to know how far out of band are you. I don't believe that a company is going to pay you $100,000 out of band.
Yeah,
So if
right.
you're looking at a band that is 180 and your expectations are closer to 280, that is not a role that I would necessarily apply for. If the band is 260 and you are like, "I cannot make below 280 or 275," I would recommend still applying because the delta there isn't so great that you're not going to be able, that they couldn't maybe get there. But generally speaking, I don't see a company jumping like 50 to 100K, if that makes sense. So, Anne, I don't know if you have anything to
Well,
add.
I think maybe $50,000
Yeah.
because if you look at these job descriptions and they want someone to sit in San Francisco or New York,
Yeah.
and this looks like the range is low, and they may have to adjust it, and they
Yeah.
won't change. We've worked with clients that they don't change their range even when they say, "Okay, now we know we have to pay over 300." The job description still says 240 to 280.
Yeah.
So
Especially if the candidate that maybe wants to make more, it has like 10 more years of experience as well. So I think there's a nuance there. I think to answer that question, like if you really want to apply for the role and you think it's the perfect role for you and comp is the only barrier, go for it. And if you're kind of close, maybe within 50K of the salary range, I would go for it as well.
yeah.
Semi-related to this, what types of bases do you see other than current comp for an increase in the offered base comp?
Say that one more time.
What types of bases do you see other than current comp for an increase in the offered base comp? I think what that's trying to get off of after is what other bases besides compensation are offered in the base compensation? What other bases for compensation are offered besides actual compensation, actual salary?
Okay, I think what other benefits maybe
Yeah,
is
I think that that's what they're getting after,
okay, and
other than the
so
current compensation.
whoever asked that question can throw that into the chat if we're getting
Yeah.
that right. I think a couple different things like 401k match. I hear a lot about is there a 401k match? Surprises at an early stage company generally not. Benefits in terms of health benefits, what is covered? Like commuting costs, is that covered or is there a benefit there? If you're required to be in office, what's the flexibility? Are you
Flexibility. Yeah.
badging in at 9 a.m.? Do you have to be there? We've had a lot of questions lately about lawyers who are moms, right? And are they know they have to be in office, but they need to drop their daughter or son off at daycare. And can they come in at 9:15 or is someone going to be like, "Where are you?" Can they leave at 4:30 if they're in the office? So those kind of piece
Those
together maybe
non-tangibles. Yeah.
non-tangibles, yes.
Yeah, I saw a question in there asking if you should apply to roles if it says they want someone on site and these candidates have to be remote. I think you should still apply. I think that what happens is if someone really wants someone, when we're involved in these searches, we're always looking to find someone who can be on site if they want someone on site. But I have a situation right now where there is a candidate that is just slam dunk that does not live here. And they are like, what do we do? Can we make an exception? Can this person get here? So sometimes they flex. We are moving to much more in-office
Yeah.
culture, and you guys are all feeling it. So people are moving back to hubs to get new jobs. I'm seeing that happen. But I do think you should still, if you're on point, I think you should apply because you never know what's going to happen.
I do think what I'm experiencing in our practice is that you shouldn't, if you do apply, do not be upset that they don't reply to your resume because frankly, a lot of folks are just looking for people in San Francisco. So they may not respond. And I just think, when there's the narrative, oh, I've applied to 20 different jobs and haven't gotten any responses, I think a lot of that does come down to location. And I think more than ever, I'm seeing like really an emphasis on where people live and not even wanting to talk to folks. Even if they say San Francisco or remote, they start with San Francisco and they start with those people that are rooted in the Bay Area.
Yeah, I just saw a question about smaller companies and titles. Titles are, you know, eh, I was at Google in 2001 helping them build their legal team. No one cared about title. They just wanted to get in. You know, titles have become much more important. And I think at smaller companies, it's important to ask a lot of questions, but be more flexible. If it's a pretty hot company, you want to be a part of it. I just think being more flexible on title is better, but I understand not wanting to take a step back. But a lot of these companies haven't put bans in yet. I mean, they're asking us like, what should these titles be? So it's a little bit of, taking a risk on title sometimes, being flexible, but if you can get a nice title, that's great. Um,
I
I don't know, Matt, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll just share what I've seen in my practice. So generally, if I'm looking at a number two for an early stage startup, for instance, we've done a number two roles under the GC at AI startups. I'm not seeing those folks being called senior director. Senior director and VP feel kind of scary for these small companies. It's giving away a very important title early on. Doesn't mean you're not deserving of that, but it does mean that they're probably unlikely to do that. Heads of, which is written in the chat, is also another one that I think people have a very adverse reaction to because they don't want to have a head of reporting into a head of. What I've seen generally is a lot of number twos at these startups are called AGCs. Because Meta has 1,000 AGCs and maybe Google has a bunch of AGCs, a lot of candidates are disenchantized with the AGC title. I'll just say that. Or they say, oh, my friend who has 5 years of experience got an AGC title. I think there needs to be some flexibility around this. If you have an offer to be a number two out of a startup with a lot of growth opportunity, with a great comp package, and you are hung up on title, I really want you to evaluate why. Because I think getting an AGC title at with a really great job, that's where you maybe need to kind of flex on. And I don't see a lot of these startups giving stronger titles early on just because they don't want to give it away that early and they don't have a formal structure. So they fear giving a VP title and then, in 2 years when they create the structure and the title and the bands, they have an issue.
Yeah, I had a candidate, this is interesting, it really took me by surprise, who got an AGC title at a startup, and it was a great role. And she said, I don't like the AGC title because Facebook has 1,000 of them. I'm like, oh my God, an AGC title. I mean, they have given away a lot of those titles, but an AGC title is coveted at most places, and it can mean a lot of things. It could mean a number two at some places. So anyway, I think we've got our point across on that.
Yeah.
So if we go, Matt, to the next slide,
Yeah.
um, and I know we want to leave time for a question. We can start with questions now, but we did touch upon some of the things on the employer side, and I wanted to just call out that if you are hiring in your legal team and you have a talent partner, to make sure that these talent partners are talking about compensation from the outset, and really is there room with candidates, having a nice conversation with them, and every time they're touching base with them, aligning on comp. That's what we have to do. And what happens with companies is where they really make mistakes is, and you all have been there, you go to make an offer at the end, and Sally, who you made the offer to, is like, no way, I'm not taking that comp, because they weren't aligned the entire time. By the time you get to offer, your people in the pool should understand, or the finalist candidates should understand what the comp looks like, hopefully the equity, hopefully the bonus, and maybe get the benefits at the end and be able to accept an offer. So I think talent partners really inside these companies could be helpful in really aligning on comp. Maddie touched upon it. Equity should be explained. I think some companies do a really nice job of graphs and charts towards the end at private companies, and public companies have like pages on how their equity has worked. I think, companies do a huge mistake. Internal negotiations. I saw a question in the chat about internal negotiations. It's pretty hard. If Maddie's my boss and we're doing deals all night together and I have to go to her and say I'm underpaid, it's just harder when you're inside sometimes to advocate for yourself, to get a bigger title, to get more money, and there's a nuance to it. And I think a lot of that knowledge is power, looking at things holistically, look at the hours I'm putting on, look at what the market is paying, and kind of advocating very subtly for yourself that way is helpful. But I know it can be challenging.
I think that's a really important point, and one we did want to touch on is just internal negotiation. I think it's been no surprise in the last 10 years. I think we can see it on people's resumes that you make the most money in between jobs when you leave and you negotiate, right? It is historically very difficult to negotiate comp internally. What I wanted to make sure I shared on this call is I think if you are thinking, well, I think everyone should do this. I think everyone should have a list of all their accomplishments that they have done in the last year or the last 2 years in a role, so that when they go to negotiate their comp internally, they have the knowledge and they have the work that they've done to be able to say and have the data to say to their manager, look, I really am going to push for an increase in comp. Here's what I'm seeing in the market. So that knowledge that we've talked about. And here is all the value I've added for the company. Whether that manager hopefully is like, of course, you've added all this value, but generally they need to go to someone else internally, right? Who hasn't seen your work. And I think whether you're creating a resume, it's a great bouncing off point to create a resume, but having that information on specifics on either it's percent of revenue or the numbers that you've driven for those different causes, whether it's growing a team from 2 to 8 or whatever it is, the metrics, I think is really important when you go to negotiate comp internally.
And I think that addition to the metrics can be saving on outside counsel costs. Look, I know that I saved $1 million on
Yeah.
outside or our team did. So that is something that can be a pain point or as well. But also I have to deal with management teams when hiring CLOs and GCs and head of legals, and we're negotiating comp, and the client's saying to me, well, we want to pay X. And I have to say, keep in mind, this is your head lawyer. They're going to see everything in this company. So if you're going to pay them, 50% less than your CFO, they're going to see that. And how are they going to feel? So lawyers have a lot of exposure to what people make. And that is something that, I don't know, that I will bring to their attention. So I think the key here is all the way around, transparency really builds trust and loyalty. And I really want to leave some time for questions. So why don't we pause and just see what questions we haven't answered?
I've been
Olivia?
tracking, yeah. So I'm going to start with Harold's question. When in your career do you want to seek a contract versus at-will employment?
Hmm, that's a good question. Um, I think that,
Generally, I think sometimes they'll do a contract at senior levels, for CLO, GC roles, but generally it's an offer letter and at-will employment. I don't,
maybe this
yeah.
means just like their own career path is what I'm thinking. I think more than ever, frankly, in the last like 5 years, we've seen a lot of people move into contract, fractional GC, those types of roles. And I think it's really dependent on what you have going on in your personal life, frankly. Like if you want to be more tied to a specific job or if you want more flexibility, I would say generally that's pretty clear in the beginning, and companies aren't going to negotiate that at the end if that's what this question is referring to. Like generally, we're looking for full-time candidates. Sometimes if they have a really, really difficult time and there's a contractor that maybe wants the job, sometimes they will engage that contractor. But I have folks that say to me, "Oh, I'm not looking for a full-time job, but I'll do some fractional GC work." And generally my clients will say, "Well, that's not what we're looking for right now. We'll move on." I haven't done a ton of work where we've shifted from a full-time role to a contract role.
I don't know if they're talking about a contractor, Maddie, or an actual contract between the
Oh,
company and the legal person. So
hmm.
rather than an
Okay.
app. So
That's an interesting
I don't
question.
see a lot of contracts being unless it's a CLO, a pretty seasoned role,
Person.
if that's a question.
And if it was, Harold, if you were still on and you would like some more clarification for that, please feel free to put it in the chat. Emily, moving on, Emily asked, when a company requires you to put the salary expectations in an online application form, what should you put?
I'm so sad that they're doing this because it really rubs me the wrong way, to be honest. That is a really great question.
I think
It
you have to
depends.
be honest. I think you have to, be honest in terms of what I will ask candidates the question, what are your compensation expectations? What do you need to make a transition? And people generally, they don't want to share what they're making, but they generally might share that. And I think that's what you want to put in these applications. I have sometimes people don't, I know they won't take them now. It used to be that some of them just wouldn't fill it out.
It's a lot of times what I've heard from candidates, and you guys can write in the chat if this is true, but they won't allow the application to go
To
through
go
without
in.
putting something in
Yeah.
that field. Generally, what I would do is I would pick something that's maybe higher where if they have a range on the website on the job description and that is an okay range for you, I would put the range. That's what I would do personally. If they don't, I would think about what you really want and say, in that field, I'm flexible on compensation, but I would like a base salary starting at X number. Ideally, it's above where you make. Ideally, it's a reasonable number. Maybe it's in line with other job descriptions you've seen, and hopefully that is enough for them to kind of come back to you.
Yeah.
And
Ben
then I
said,
would, when you get on the phone if you get an interview, I would ask the range. I know you asked for my salary expectations, but I'd really like to hear the range for the role and make them tell you.
yeah, someone saying in the chat that they asked they put competitive compensation.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of times I have to say to candidates, like, look, they are going to pay someone competitively. They're not going to nickel and dime them. This is going to come, pretty straight down the road, be competitive pay. And I think if it's not going to reject your application, you could put that in there. So
So, Sharon asked, how long should you expect to be in the negotiation phase to be in a GC, head of legal role, CLO, etc.? How many rounds of back and forth are reasonable before the first full ask?
That is a good question.
I think, well, first of all, I feel like the negotiation starts from the beginning subtly, right? When I'm dealing with a CLO GC search, what is it going to take to get you? What are your comp expectations? What are you leaving on the table? When do you get a bonus? Like I need to know it all so I can educate the client. So, and I'm constantly talking to the candidate and the client about this the entire way. So when we get to the end, I think it's two times that the candidate is going back. It's maybe like the initial, like I need more on X, Y, and Z after looking at the whole thing. Then it's meeting with the powers that be, and I would urge everyone to do this, whether it's a CLO, meeting with the CEO, if you're a CLO, GC, head of legal, or whoever you're going to report to, and having the conversation. I call it the come to Jesus conversation about your compensation. When will my comp go up? What is this company? What is the philosophy of the company? I have to, I have a vacation in November that's paid for that I need to be on. Like all of these things, you want to talk to who you're going to report to, and just so they know who you are really holistically, and you want to find out from them just the final pieces of the puzzle to ensure it's an absolute great fit all the way around.
I think the goal is that there are no surprises. That I keep thinking this in my head, like the less surprises, the better. I don't think a GC negotiation should last longer than a week. And I really don't. I feel like the first ask should be gathering all the information that you need, benefits package, what questions do you have? And that is also like, do you have questions about the scope of the role? Do you have questions
Uh,
about, who you're going to be working with cross-functionally? Do you have
Resources.
resources? Anything like that needs to be talked about and asked before, almost before the negotiation. I think that is like piece number one, getting all your questions answered and thinking sitting there and thinking like if I have this job and if I get this offer, before you get the offer, what are my outstanding questions? Then they run the references, those go well, you get the offer. Hopefully you've asked all those questions that you've needed to ask, and now it's just talking about money. And to me, that's the next negotiation around compensation, is around the actual dollar amount. And I think what I've seen in my practice is when it gets frustrating for clients at the end is when they haven't asked the questions that they need answers to around scope or around the non-comp pieces. And then they're asking them at the end and they're like, wait a minute, they had 10 rounds of interviews. Why aren't those questions answered? Why didn't they bring those up earlier? And I would encourage folks, if you need questions answered by a hiring manager, and you're almost to the end, go to the recruiter and say, you know what, I've got these 5 questions that I really would like to talk to the hiring manager about. Is there a way you can find me 15 to 20 minutes so I can connect with them while you run the references, and try to get those questions answered?
I know we have only about a minute left. We do have additional questions in the chat. Um, would you guys like me to do maybe one or two more, or do you want to go through the rest of them?
Sure,
Let's do, why don't
one
we
or
do one
two.
or two more? And then
Okay,
we'll wrap it up.
awesome. Let me see the last one.
I did see one about reporting to the
Yeah,
CFO.
that's a
That
good
was what
one.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, we got to, so if we go to search on the the GC role and the role reports to CFO, there are, 50% of the people, the candidates will just say, absolutely not. I'm not going to do it. The reasons being is they want exposure to the CEO. They don't want to be layered down. They want to make sure they have access. What does it mean about how they value the legal function? Other times you talk to GCs who are reporting to CFOs, they'll say, it's really a good thing here at this place. I love my CFO. We're partners. But it is really challenging given the amount that's been written in legal about, not reporting to a CFO. And that just shows the value of the legal function and where it's placed, and it shouldn't be there. I mean, if you're a public company and you have a GC that's reporting to a CFO, that just
That's a red
those,
flag.
yeah, it's a red flag. And those GCs have just so much public company reporting, and they've got to have exposure to a board, a seat at the table. access to the CEO. And so it's just a challenging thing. And it's not always bad. It can be great, but it is a little bit of a red flag. And it's hard to get talent to go report to a CFO, period.
I will say we are seeing it more and more.
I
So
know.
I do think that at these smaller startups, it's a different story. What we hear a lot, and what I hear a lot is, look, the CEO has 8 direct reports right now. We're hiring our first lawyer. The CFO is his right-hand person. It is not that we don't value legal. We really want a lawyer to come in and create a function, but they're going to do better under the CFO because the CFO has more time to help bring them up to speed. I think there are nuances to this. I've placed a few lawyers that report directly into the CFO who are extremely happy and really enjoy their work. I think it's a case by case basis, but I've had people who have said to me, I'm not interested in talking about a role because legal reports into the finance function. And I do kind of think that is short-sighted. If there's a great opportunity you're looking at, and that's the one negative, I think lawyers should maybe put it aside or at least dig a little bit deeper and not use it as a gating item.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. I think that
Thanks,
is all the time that we
Olivia.
have for questions, but
Yes.
there are still a lot. I'm sure there will be so many, even after this, once we post it to our YouTube page as well.
Please
That's
feel free to
great.
reach out. We'll do our best to field questions, but we do put a lot of content out at Kerwin. Follow Ann and I on LinkedIn if you want to see kind of more, and we do compensation reports and whatnot. So just a little plug to stay connected if you can.
Yeah.
And Maddie and Ann, I'd like to invite you just to stay on after
Okay.
everybody else jumps off for just a minute. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. This is just such a generous use of your time and your talent to impart this information. And the response has been fantastic. So thank you for that.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Bridget. It's
joining.
great. It was awesome.
And if you're still on, before I finish this sentence, I will be sending a recording to all of the registrants once I can get this uploaded.
Great.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Olivia.
everyone.
Great.